Hey everyone, welcome to this panel conversation. As Hugh very delightfully introed us to there, we are all Apollo solution architects, although me not so much anymore. But more importantly, we're also all ex-champions. So we've all been in the position you guys are in, or some of you guys are in, where we know the struggles of fighting it all the way through. And for those, I see a few familiar faces who came to the Champions pitch workshop yesterday. You spend all of your time, all of your efforts getting to the place where you get your Supergraph into production. Yes, that's your focus. You could spend a year and a half fighting that transformative change. And then it gets to production, and what do you do next? Everything then changes. Like, your entire focus has been on convincing people that this is the way forward, getting the resource to do the work and the budget to do everything, and then building it all, going through the first iteration, and then it gets into production. And as the slide behind me says, now what? And that's where everything changes. You go from the world where you've been focusing on this build element, and now you're into this observing, growing, defending almost, because now you are the incumbent tech. There will be other people trying to challenge you. So what we're going to do today, hopefully, is give you some ideas about some of the things you should be thinking about after you've gone into production. The things maybe that you may not be thinking of, that may not initially be obvious. So without further ado, we probably should at least intro ourselves a little bit from what we've done in the past. Well, I'll start. So I'm an customer of Apollo, as previously mentioned. I used to work for RS Components, where I championed the initial adoption of GraphQL into their front-end tech stack, which didn't go quite as planned when we ended up with 13 BFFs spread across our entire architecture. And that's when it's like, okay, we need to fix this. We moved on to Federation. Then spent, let's say, a year and a half building out the case for it, building the business case, getting it all out. Finally get it done, start development, into production, and then I left literally 2 days later to join Apollo. When I handed the reins over to Daljit.
Traitor. So when he effectively left, there's no point in me reiterating of the story he's stated. He effectively left at a point where the strategy was in place, and so most of the implementation was done by myself. So he looked after all the meetings, and then I looked after the implementation. And when I got stuck, how did we do this? So a little bit about me. I'm an SA, haven't always been, and the bit I'm about to say to you is actually now useful because of the way that I thought about the problem when Andy left. So previously I was in forensics and criminology. So what felt useless in that life, I did actually borrow to create strategies to actually help deliver as a champion when he left. And effectively then that went on for a year. More subgraphs came online. We went into production, ran into hiccups, and learnt the hard way what we needed to be observing and finding, and then obviously replaying back into the strategy and reinforcing and galvanizing the federated stack we just built. And then that's it.
And then you left.
And then I left.
Yeah, and then myself, my name's Shane Myrick. Before Apollo, currently I'm an SA, helping a lot of enterprise customers adopt their graph. I was at Expedia Group, where I was on the team that initially created GraphQL from nothing, because we found the use case. So that team spun out, became bigger as it grew to hotels, and then all of hotels, and then more teams like flights and insurance and cars all wanted to adopt the graph, and helped everyone basically become this thing that we wrote for ourselves turn into a platform in itself, and had to then learn how to roll out an entire new API technology to the entire company, when just a couple months ago I was doing it for just myself and like 2 people. So yeah, it's been a fun journey here at Expedia and at Apollo too.
And of course now we all talk to probably a lot of you guys in the room, and we get to now crowdsource all the information that we learned the hard way and extend that. So we're hoping to pass some of that knowledge on to you today. So without further ado, the first thing I mentioned earlier was observability and observing what you're doing in the graph. So the first question we're going to talk about today is, what are the most important things to observe now that your Supergraph is in production? And I think maybe, who shall I pick? Which one? Shall I go with Shane first?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we talk about, if you went to the observability workshop, basic things, of course, you should probably get set up before you go to production, which is your metrics and tracing observability. Those are all things we know, right, and get set up. But what is often not used after that fact is actually looking back and tracking metrics over the health of time. Not necessarily alerts. Usually in that initial production launch phase, it's if something goes wrong, then we check everything, right? It's there to make sure you catch those errors. But now that you're getting bigger, you have more teams, actually you have a history of telemetry going on, you can start doing a little more deep dive into kind of things that might be, I don't know, a little bit like unexpectedly slower, or just you don't think they should be that slow, and maybe it's fine today. It's really taking advantage of some of the features you get from, you're now connecting a bunch of APIs. There's a lot more things that are now connected with a single query, and that often involves like doing a deep dive into metrics that sometimes people don't do when you only own a small little sliver of your stack before. Yeah, Daljit, do you have anything?
It's exceptionally important that this is on. It's the same as lights on or lights off. There's a quote. I haven't come up with this. But it's some other clever person said it. You cannot manage what you don't measure. So if you're not measuring, there's no possible way that you're ever going to attain any feedback loop to let you know that are you going in the correct direction or not. So for us, it was absolutely critical to understand what were our fears, what did we want to measure, what was detrimental, that if it went wrong, that it was either happening, could we detect it in a premeditative way, or as soon as possible if it had occurred in terms of a consequential event. So observability is going to be one of the most powerful things that you can enable. If you don't have that, you simply won't have the intelligence, the intel to make informed decisions in fixing something and moving forward in the correct direction. So my advice would be is understand holistically what's important to you, and effectively build dashboards and insights into the system at the start. So start putting hooks in at the start and start evolving your observability stack at a much higher cadence when it goes live, because there's nothing worse than a problem occurring and you don't even know where to look. So it's absolutely imperative that observability is right at the forefront.
Yeah, there's a specific example, I think, where that came up at Expedia, where before we were powering our search page, details page, they're all calling different APIs. Search had to be obviously a lot faster. I'll move this a little bit closer. Search had to be obviously a lot faster to get your results. And after we moved stuff to the graph, we actually realized that certain edge cases, we would find price differences between the search results and the detail results, and we just never noticed them before. But we only started noticing them because we could query for everything all at once in the graph. And so it was like this weird behavior that before it's really hard to go across multiple APIs and reproduce that. But now that we're in the graph, it was, we were able to find these things happening, but it was actually even easier to like make a query that then reproduced it a lot simpler too. So there's like these weird edge cases. Sometimes they just don't stand out when you have hundreds of microservices you're calling before, and you actually start collecting everything into one location.
For us, when we did that, it wasn't as big as a price difference. We had odd latency intervals between certain requests coming to the system, and we were able to trace down to very specific services that were actually causing that. And actually then we could reach out to these teams and say, listen, so we've got a federated stack now, and this aspect of the query is taking this much longer, and it seems to be coming from this estate. Can we do anything to help you? Do you need any insight, further insight? What can we do? I mean, it just created I've got to use a business word, sorry, synergy between all of us, and that's in relation to Shane's point. It's very important.
Well, I think there's something in that. Well, I think one of the things that as an opportunity you don't really think about before you have a Supergraph in production is that before that, if you, as Shane was saying, if you've got all these microservices there, it's not just edge cases like, the price being wrong. It's like, where are all the errors going when you're calling services? It's invisible because you've got a client app that's just going, hey, API, give me your stuff. And then nothing comes back. Well, in a lot of cases, then pretty much everywhere I've worked, clients do not actually then log out that error somewhere. No one really is aware of it. And you've just lost a customer. When you have the Supergraph there, you're now introducing this horizontal thing. You're no longer dependent on the varying quality of observability across 50, 60, 70 microservices. You now have this one thing that you can focus in on. You can build that visibility into the things that are going wrong. And actually, it's a good way of demonstrating a value of why you've just done this initiative. You now have this platform, this kind of thing where you can start to introduce governance. And that leads us quite nicely onto our next question, where my clicker's not working. There we go. Is demonstrating the value of your Supergraph. There's a very important thing here, is that you've asked for this investment, you've asked for the business to actually say, right, let's make this big change. You need to constantly keep demonstrating and playing back why that was an important decision, especially if you are just at the start of your journey and you've still got 10, 15, 20, 40, 60, 80 microservices, different domains, different whatever. You're going to need extra money. So one of the big things that I definitely don't see many organizations doing is thinking about what key indicators they should try and find to demonstrate the value of their Supergraph. What metrics should they be tracking? And more importantly, if you can put a dollar value on those as well, that's a great thing. Daljit, can you think of something you think might be important?
I can actually. So we were a global e-com company. So latency was a really important metric, as I'm sure it will be for a majority of you guys. So the latency through the system was very, very important. The other thing that ended up being important, but we didn't pay too much attention to first, was the caching, effectively. We understood at any point in time how much of our system was using hot cache and when it was going cold. And we could tune specific resolvers in the system to have a completely different profile to any other resolver based upon the traffic coming in. Errors wasn't too much of a problem at that point in time, I think. It was always latency. That was the first metric that we put on. And then using correlation IDs, we were able to then demonstrate to a high standard at what point the greatest junction was in the stack. And obviously what happens is when you add a metric in, what will happen, you put it in a very superficial way at the start, and then you'll start using that in a more advanced way because the level of implementation gets better. So your latency numbers become more accurate, the cache numbers become more accurate, then you might introduce errors in later. But the key here is finding out what's important to you. Those were important to us, but what is important to you? And basically have as many horizontal conversations as you can, because you might not know at the start, and implement what's important for the business. That's the best advice I can tell you.
I think just to build on the caching element there that Daljit was talking about, one of the things that's now being implemented at RS is to tie that to a dollar value. When you're caching at the Supergraph layer, you're stopping all those upstream calls to backing services, expensive calls to legacy systems. You can implement caching across the entire thing. And they've started to monitor just how many cache hits they're getting, and then what the implications are in dollar terms or pound terms, because we're British, of the underlying infrastructure. They're all based in the cloud. You call them less, you lose less resources. So you can actually start to have a cost saving on the underlying infrastructure of your entire API platform. And if you put that in a dashboard and you start seeing these dollar figures starting increasing up, it's a great way of going back to your bosses, the CTO, the CEO, and going, hey, look, I know we cost this much money to run this, but we're also saving all this. And you can quite often probably get to the point where it's cost neutral.
Yeah. Thanks, actually, you reminded me of that. Yeah, that turned out to be the most powerful metric in the end, because we had a cost attribution based upon kind of a synthetic guess at how much it would cost, and just creating multiples of it in the dashboards. And then we had so many different people in the business suddenly interested in the federated stack, because everybody had a number that was useful to them that they could take back. I don't know if...
Yeah. I mean, so for us, we started tracking metrics when we first created the graph. It was more about just consistency, not necessarily of yes, of data, but that was the biggest value we did for creating the graph, was we wanted to make sure that our whole selling point of doing GraphQL was that we now have one API versus a mobile BFF and a web BFF and all these different BFFs we had. So we sold the graph on consistency of data and just customer experience across the app. But then as we became the GraphQL platform team that then managed the router, which was then the gateway and all these different subgraphs and teams onboarding, we got a lot more people making queries and then coming to us and saying, hey, the flights query doesn't work. And it's like, well, I know nothing about flights, but it's going to the gateway, right? So why aren't you fixing it? So the Supergraph became the entry point for everyone to start raising alerts and raising things. And so we started tracking our error rates for essentially the entire website, but all through the Supergraph, but also not error rates. Also, we were tracking our platform team resolution time. This kind of leads back a little bit to the observability point before, which is you want to know who owns particular types and fields, because the platform team doesn't want to become all of a sudden the one support team for the entire Supergraph, right? There is subgraphs underneath that know how to actually fix those things. So we were tracking, it changed over time. It was okay, first we're going to track, just the adoption, how many subgraphs are being onboarded per week. Then it became how many error rates we're tracking every day. And then after that became resolution time to actually getting things fixed and resolved. So there was definitely a transformation. We didn't necessarily have a direct monetary value to that, but we could track maybe error rates to monetary value that we would get out of that too.
I think attaching monetary value is obviously the ideal end state, but it can be quite tricky to do. This didn't happen with Federation with us because we adopted GraphQL before Federation. But one of the key metrics that we were looking at that point was how much were we going to speed up the client teams to actually allow them to deliver more. And we actually did a study of before and after code when they moved to GraphQL. And it removed, on average, across all the client experiences, 36% of the code just by moving to GraphQL. Now, if you're coming from non-GraphQL to GraphQL, then that's a good metric to track. That is a good way of demonstrating that, hey, we've just removed all that extra code. It's made everything faster. It's increased the velocity of the teams. It's made everything simpler. It's easier to test. There's less things to break, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of metrics you can pull out if it's a non-GraphQL to GraphQL situation. Federation obviously won't deliver anything on top of that because it's still GraphQL, but you can still find other things probably that by having a unified data model across the org you're saving on.
Yeah, I think the best piece of advice I can dispense on key indicators is everybody has a perspective and a point of view in this room. And you own that, but it might not be right. I'm not saying that you won't be right, but you won't be wrong. That's just your perspective. the key is making sure that as champions, you are talking with as many people as possible to gain more perspectives, because you won't believe how much you can find out based upon the fact that you had a single track vision and it only took a very slight degree deviation to realize an entire world of information that you previously didn't know. So keep conversations, keep engagement high with everybody around you.
Now, moving on from this particular topic, the other thing that happens when you move from the build phase is that up until that point, you've been building to a goal. You know exactly what you're doing. You know exactly the scope of what the services you're adding in, et cetera, et cetera. Things don't change. It's the initial build. As soon as you click that deploy button and things are in production, you're now in maintenance mode. There's changes. And the other big important thing that needs to really start to come into effect after you launch is governance and stewardship. How do you make sure that you're maintaining the quality of the graph? How do you make sure that you're educating your teams and making sure that they're actually doing things in the right way? So Shane, what would you say some of the key governance strategies to put in place?
Yeah, I mean, getting started, you probably got things out in production, but if you haven't done it for the third, the fourth, the 15 onboarding, I'd definitely make sure you have some sort of templating for subgraphs, things onboarding onto the graph, and that might even be before production. But after that templating, what we did after that is we established a guild champions community within the company itself, where it was a weekly meeting where we discussed everything from big changes people were doing on their graph to we handled schema proposals, or if you wanted to particularly add a new root level query, you actually had to bring that to the champions community. We tried to make sure that champions community was full of not just the back-end producers' data, but the front-end teams, the designers, as much as possible, just so that we had varying opinions in this champions community. Now, it wasn't necessarily required for everyone to attend, but we found that doing that little enforcement of like to get a new root query on, not necessarily, or a new subgraph on, which is kind of usually the same time, that allowed them to just understand what they were doing. We had documented a bunch of best practices that we wanted to see in our schema, and so we could go through them at that time, which helped educate everyone. And so that community became pretty powerful. Honestly, a lot of people just like attending just to even keep up with what other people were doing in their schemas and graph across the company.
Thanks, Shane. That's so. Working at Apollo and talking to loads of customers in loads of different areas of business, we found out there's like 4 governance models or stewardship models that you can fundamentally have inside of your company. One being where you start off, and 4 being the most advanced. And ideally, the goal is to know which one you're in and to be able to make productive steps to getting to the next one. Ideally, getting to the 4th one, because at the 4th one, you're pretty much, you've reached God mode in terms of how you're managing the strategy and the governance and the stewardship. It's absolutely imperative that you get this sorted, because you will have put so much effort into building this thing, corralling it, growing it, talking about it, defending it. There's no point doing all that and then neglecting it at the end, where it starts to effectively implode on itself because there's no supporting mechanism for it. So you've got to make sure that you know which of those models you're in and you're moving forward. But it's got to be at the forefront. You've got to be thinking about it.
I think the other thing that is often forgotten about is education. It's constant education. Obviously, Shane, you mentioned having like guilds and stuff like that. I think establishing that as early as possible, but also thinking about either sourcing materials elsewhere or creating your own educational materials, because people come and go, teams change, and it's an ever needed requirement that you are educating people about how you want the graph to be what you want in there, any standards you have, and just simply what is GraphQL? How do you use GraphQL? How do we do GraphQL? What do we define an entity as, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That all these topics need to be at least be documented somewhere, or ideally in some kind of like video-based training course, or however you want to do it. But I think not forgetting about education, that's the thing that will probably help you the most in the long run, alongside obviously the more standard things of, hey, we need to make sure this thing is being developed as we want it. Now, we're nearly at time, and we probably haven't got that much time for questions, but we are going to be doing a topic table tomorrow in the Eventide foyer over by where the keynote was this morning. So myself and Dajit will be there for half an hour. If you want to come along and ask us questions there, just please come and do it. Or alternatively, I'm sure I don't think any of us have got anything after this. So you just come and grab us. We'll happy chat through things. Yeah, save your questions for tomorrow, or ask them now, whatever you want to do, or reach out. I think probably a chunk of you are already on our Slack or LinkedIn. Probably not too hard to find because we work for Apollo. And of course, if you enjoyed this, or if you'd like to give some feedback, please submit it using the QR code above. Always great to hear what you thought about things. And yeah, thanks for attending, guys. Been a pleasure.
Thank you.